Do you think Davido makes his money from Africa or from the diaspora in terms of hard currency? Do you think Wizkid makes his money locally or Burna Boy? They make their money, and India, that has an average GDP of $1,900 per citizen, is actually number 6, above France, above Belgium, above Switzerland. Go and check it.
Leadership obviously is critical to every resource, because leadership is the main centerpiece that organizes all resources for efficiency, or the opposite of it being inefficiency. When you have hopeless leaders, then the word speaks for itself. Hope is lost. Less hope. Here we have African leaders who generally, in the main, 55 countries, but in the main, political leaders tend to be career-driven. Career politicians seeking power to a large extent, who should by all means be avoiding the concept of rulership, but tends to go more towards rulership in the main, because power is what they seek. The real concern is power and rulership leads to the concept of command instead of consult. Now, when you want to consult, you would see leadership there present, and the absence of consultation to a large extent, and the absence of cooperation would lead to a large extent to command. And that's where we find Africa right now. It takes us more of command than actually cooperation. And cooperation, added with the concept of consultation, would lead to competition. You can be more competitive as a leader if you actually combine those two. But here we have a case where, leadership has turned into kind of a profession, not just for one generation, but it's now becoming a generational career, and it's very profitable, very lucrative actually. Now, leadership generally can be servant, and that's what servant leadership is about. Political leadership is more about servant leadership, not really master. You are more of a servant of the people. And there we have the situation where the other side of the equation is followership. And this is what people don't speak about. They don't speak more about followership than leadership. They focus on leadership and leadership. The most developed countries tend to focus a lot more on followership. And if your followership is organized, then leadership will represent the followers. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening right now. The first question about followership is, do you even know the difference between community? Do you know the difference between community and society? And do you know the difference between communities, or the relationship between community, society, and nation? If you don't even start from that basic premise, then obviously you will not even get to the concept of patriotism, because patriotism is the centerpiece of political leadership, which should also be servant leadership in a way. And unfortunately, in all theories of leadership, the main leadership is not even the companies. The main leadership is actually the organizer, the arbiter, the political leadership, which tends to be lacking. So to a large extent, if I come back to your question, just to make sure I stay within the frame of your question, I would say yes, African leaders are technically driving away the skilled force. And the drive for power, the desire for control, the desire to command and to secure the future for their own generations coming behind, who are becoming the next political leaders, unfortunately is creating a kingdom, not political leadership. And kingdom is rulership. Kingdom is not based on political leadership, it's based on rulership. So you have this complete mismatch between what they should be doing as leaders. Instead of building from bottom up, it's becoming a case of top down. And that's command. That's not cooperation. That's not consultation. Unfortunately, that's where Africa is. And I would agree with you that yes, to a large extent, Africa is kind of effectively, and I think intentionally, chasing away the skilled force. I'll stop there. Thank you for that. To do that, I would have to share my screen with some data.
Yes.
Okay, can you see that?
It's sad that my system shut down. I have to go on my phone. I can't display more data. Now, if you look at if you go on the internet and you look at the top 25 economies, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Look at the top 25 economies. And India, that has an average GDP of $1,900 per citizen, is actually number 6, above France, above Belgium, above Switzerland. Go and check it. Now, what I'm trying to get at is this. The Indians overseas are making an average $28,000 on average. I mean, there's disparity, but on average about $28,000, while the Africans overseas are making an average about $4,000 to $6,000. Now, you don't understand what that means really to foreign exchange. You don't understand what that means. India's currency for 10 years has only depreciated by 56%. African currencies has depreciated by close to 200 to 300%. What is that telling you? It's telling you that being overseas is not a problem. Being in the diaspora is not a problem. It is necessary because you bring in the ideas, you bring in new ideas, you bring new contacts, and you don't understand. Going overseas is not really about running away. It's about opening new channels. The opportunities you open is what you open down to bring down home. But unfortunately, because of the way people go overseas, disorganized. Let me give you an example. The Foreign Commonwealth Office in the UK has over 14,000 employees working in all their embassies, 270-something embassies and consulates all over the world. They bring in £625 billion a year. Now, the US foreign, the states, I've forgotten correct, the State Department, they've got about 14,700 embassies and consulates in 168 countries plus around the world. They're bringing in $4.6 trillion US. Do you really think those people from the US who are overseas are not called diaspora? Are they also diaspora? The Indians overseas, are they not called diaspora? The difference between Africa and them is that they are very organized. There's a mission. And that's why I said in the case earlier, using the analogy of Moses, the Israelites had no mission. It was God that gave Moses the mission to take them out to where he wanted, but he wanted them to learn how to build a city before he took them back to the promised land. Africa has no clear vision, no leadership, no organization. In that context, when you describe small snippets of people who come and live, let me give you an example. Ghana's VAT has gone from 4% to 19%. Now you're telling me examples of Ghana. You're telling me examples of people in Ghana, but I'm telling you an example of Ghana as a whole. Ghana is the worst performing currency in Africa right now. I would want somebody to speak to that. You can tell me one or two people, snippets, who cannot even live safely because of the disaster on the ground. If you are not organized in terms of embassies, in terms of diaspora, understanding that they need to connect with themselves and build communities like the South Koreans are doing, like the Russians do. I'm sorry to say that with all these small snippets we pick up, we are very good at magnifying small things. We are very good at taking the smallest thing and magnify. Oh, whiskey, Davido. How much do they contribute to the economy? This is what we are struggling with. We magnify the small things. It's almost like penny wise, pound foolish. We magnify the smallest things to give it some kind of flavor, while the biggest things we don't work on. India is $1,900 on average, and India is the 6th largest economy in the world, growing 3 times the rate of America. Try to look at that. If you really want Africans to come back or even contribute to diaspora, you have to make that currency valuable. And the only way you can make the currency valuable in Africa is to increase your productivity. You need diasporans, you need locals, but you need the system, the systemic. That system is missing. And that's where it comes to the beginning of this discussion, leadership or lack thereof.
Wow, thank you, Ladi. We're going to take a short breather and then we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit about the strategy. When Ladi spoke, he mentioned India, and I remember China and some other Far East countries who had a strategy over a period of time of bringing strategy through immigration or through the diaspora. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And when we come back, let's just take a breather, sink in a bit, and we'll be back in a minute.
Okay. Juman there. Yeah, their mom. Yeah, their mom. Yeah, their mom. I'm here to cry their mom. Fawam. From again, I'm finding kitchen. Seconds view. I'll see you wait a second. That's my food, you know. That's my food, you know. We are waiting. We did this, we brand this. They are looking so. Charlie, if I brand me brave few in your mouth.
Thank you. I think the driving force of it, I think, is still going to come down to the reason why people actually go overseas mostly, which is education. Education is the biggest mind developing system you can ever think about. I mean, like I said in my previous video I did with you, the Europeans came to Africa, Ethiopia, they came to Egypt, they learned, they came to study. The Chinese went to America to study. The Chinese went all over the world, they were picking up, and they're still learning. They're still learning. So if you really want to change the dynamics, you need to first build a strategy from your education, because your youth are the largest population and they're the game changers. Now, those youths have to be well developed to global standards, at least to degree standards. And you need to connect those local with those, it's not a rivalry. It's supposed to be a cooperation between those who are local and those who are international. And with technology now, it's so easy that you actually can bring in a lot of the best skills in every area and develop your human capital. Like the Indians have done. Indians give their students loans to study overseas. Do you think the Indians are stupid? Sorry for the language. The Indians are sending loans to so the parents have to give some security against the land or property. They take the money, they go to overseas country where the currency is good. But the Indian government knows that many of them will likely not come back. But the difference is the Indian provides the platform for the students, the young people, to actually become useful. When you go to countries where they allow you to work 20 hours a week and you're earning more than your parents have earned for the last 3 years locally, then you have this mass flock and you have the numbers. You have them going overseas, they're developing themselves, but then they're also connecting locally. Because anybody who makes a lot of money overseas will still look back home, so long as home is not held. If home has a good currency, if home has need for opportunities to increase their capital, the truth is there's no real growth in Europe. There's no real growth in America. The growth is in the developing countries, the so-called underdeveloped countries. That's where the growth is. I mean, growth is simply building something up. There's no road, there's no water. When there's nothing, there's opportunities everywhere. But if you don't build the human capital, start with education. When you have the right set of education, you'll get the right set of leadership. And once you got that leadership in place, cooperate, consult, compete. Not with yourselves, compete against the best. There's hope. Sorry, can I just chip something into that, please? Just
go ahead,
a second.
Go ahead, yeah.
I want to make it clear and categorical that what I'm talking about is the ideology. And to assume that you only do well when you are local, I'll ask you a simple question. Do you think Davido makes his money from Africa or from the diaspora in terms of hard currency? Do you think Whiskey makes his money locally or Burna Boy? They make their money from the largest population in the diaspora. So, you know, let's be very careful to assume that those who are foreign are not contributing. And this is what I've been trying to say. The ideology is that the Americans have a whole network that brings in 4.6 trillion from their diaspora. Not just diaspora, but they facilitate the export of those products and they make the money from out there. The Foreign Commonwealth Office in Britain does the same. The Indians did the same. We saw it in Ukraine. When there were problems in there, the first country to move in from any third world country was India. India moved in and took out all their citizens back to India. They accounted for every single one of them. This is what I'm saying. We need both sides. We can't sit in one fence and say, oh, you have to be on the ground, then you are the one that's patriotic. Patriotism is not because you're on the ground. In fact, the worst people who are destroying Africa is on the ground. Those on the ground right now. The people who are seeking the correction of this madness, if I call it, is actually overseas. Because they know better that there's good things back home, but it's not happening. So yes, we have to go between both sides, but to assume that those who are local are more patriotic is actually not very correct. For me, to come, the analogy, I like to use analogy. And the analogy was a pastor who said in one of these sermons I was present at. He said, if you can't go, your money can go. So, everybody doesn't have to be in Africa. Embassies around the world are there to open up channels for diasporan citizens of that country to take advantage of opportunities. If a British citizen, if I go into Nigeria now with a British passport, I will go to the British embassy and I'll ask them I want to do certain things. They will give me all the contacts in Nigeria. They will open up channels for me to make my business successful. That's what diaspora is there for. That's what embassies are there for. That's what consulates are there for, not just visas. Now you don't understand what I'm going. This thing is very, very organized. And until they get to the point where they push their citizens to get the maximum from where they are, the citizen has no reason to be out there. In fact, the citizen will come back home naturally. So for me, if you ask me whether I want to be overseas or not, I'll go where everyone 1 hour of my life adds value to me. And if it's overseas, so be it. My child will have to decide for himself. The truth is, you know, I cannot move myself into where will become my own hell. I can't naturally, even God won't forgive me if I move myself to a place that would actually, He moved me to a promised land and I move back to hell. I wouldn't. So if it's going to work, I would contribute. But the truth is, you know, everybody for himself until we get organized. And I'm hoping that the diaspora will become more organized, because they will become, as the currencies become, there's a diagram I didn't show you. The new social funding structure in Europe, they call it green finance, in Europe, in UK, and in US, is tilting towards, before 2030, every industry would have to be green. Do you know what that means for African resources? Oil will be a liability. All these cars you are seeing them shipping into Africa, machines they are selling to Africa for cheap, they are dumping it and they are creating new energy efficient equipment. Thus, it's like exciting the economy all over again. Africa will be in a very, very tight corner in terms of the exchange rate very soon. And the only country in Africa that is making any move towards legislation to move towards green energy, and I have the map, I just couldn't present it now, is actually South Africa. So the whole Africa is sitting idle, relying on resources to borrow money and using the money to import and consume instead of producing. When the green energy system, check it out, it's called the green finance. Green finance is taking serious foothold. Europe will not deal with you unless you are on that platform, and you have to borrow money to run a new green environment completely. So if you're producing things through old oil-based fossils, they're not going to buy from you. Just like what we see now blocking out Russia, and they're going to block you out. So we are moving into a very, very critical stage that I want at least those in diaspora to come together to understand that there is a big crisis coming, a massive storm. 2030. Watch out.
First thing I want to address is the definition of the concept of diaspora. We have to start with the definition of diaspora. And diaspora, to a large extent, is by definition. Okay, thank you. So it's not for me to say what it is, but the concept or the topic today is about diaspora. And diaspora will have to start with this definition. Now, who is a diaspora, or who is in the diaspora? Now, sorry, it's just a bit. That's the definition of a diaspora: an individual, a member of networks, associations, or communities who have left their country in their physical form, but maintain links with that country. That's the definition by the International Organization of Migration. Very important to put that in context. Then we also have the question of Africans in diaspora. What are the numbers we're looking at? The numbers we're looking at is on average about 140 million, which makes up about 10% or 10 to 11% of the African current population. There's no data that kind of breaks it down into smaller stratas or any demographics, but about 10-11% of the population is kind of in the diaspora. While Africa is growing at an average rate of about 2.5 to about 3% per annum, which is about 3.25 million new Africans on average to about 4 million Africans annually. And that's quite a large number in terms of 3%, in terms of the overall growth. When we look at the Africans in diaspora, it says here that the global remittances, this is where remittances fits in, and I think that's where the data will be coming into the context of today's work or today's submissions, is that the remittance flow has increased generally in Africa by about 9% during the year. Interestingly, North Africa, Egypt particularly has been able to raise remittance of about 30 billion, which is about 5.56% of the overall global remittances. Interesting. In Egypt alone. It means that Egypt, to a large extent, has a large population, or expects to have a large population. Maybe not a large population, but maybe a very high net worth or earnings capacity overseas, possibly. The general perception is sub-Saharan Africa has basically had 56 billion, and North Africa, so that's about Africa. North Africa has about 56 billion coming in terms of remittances, and sub-Saharan Africa had about 45 billion. So you can see that North Africa, with the proximity to Europe and to a large extent America, seems to be a very important channel for remittances. Now, one important thing before going into data is the statement by Narayan Murthy, the guy who owns Infosys in India. He says, well, in God we trust, but everyone else must bring data to the table. And this is where we are now. The data on the table suggests that this is where the main destinations, sorry, these are not origins, these are actually destinations, sorry, remittances origins. Now, most migrants overseas or diasporans overseas seems to be more in the US, UAE, interestingly. Saudi Arabia is very interesting, these two, that Saudi Arabia and UAE that don't really have taxes seem to have a higher level of migrant force, I think coming mostly from Asia. Switzerland, Germany, China, put all together, and you have about remittances from all over the world of about 377 to 500 billion. Now, putting that data into context, you will see here, okay, so it doesn't allow me. So the US generally is a major source of remittances in the world, and remittances only represent about 0.3% of the US GDP, which is very tiny. Although in United Arab Emirates, it's about 12%, Saudi Arabia about 4%. They allow such money to leave their shores because, you know, to a large extent, they have a huge migrant workforce. Now, put into context, those remittances, if I go to the right, seems to come from this destination. So in Africa, based on the data found, published data, the history of migration over the years has been in this frame. So I'm trying to put it into frame. Has been around this frame, and you can see the main countries, and you can see Egypt quite particularly somewhere along the numbers that have been going overseas. Now, if I put it into data analysis, just from the data sets there, what is looking like when analyzed in more detail is suggesting that trying to fit everything to one screen, which is possible. Can you still see the screen?
Yes, please, we can. Yes, we can.
I see all data. Okay. So where you see Egypt, generally, 1990, the total population that was migrating was about 11 to 12 million, which was about 1.86% of the population of Africa. By 2020, 10 years later, the population migrating had gone from 11.8 million to about 28 million, which is making up about 2.6%. So in terms of ratios, it's increased. In terms of numbers, it's also increased, even though the growth has also increased significantly. So what you're looking at here is that the number of increases and the change in data suggests that only one country, Ethiopia particularly, I think it's because they had some wars around this time, but generally Ethiopia was the only country that had a lower percentage growth in terms of numbers living. But there was a significant increase in numbers over the years. I think it's about 136%, which is about 1.3 times. And if you look at these numbers, it looks like the numbers that are migrating out or exiting Africa seems to be quite significant. When you break it down into more detail and you summarize it into regions, then this data comes forth. Central Africa particularly was not represented much in the top numbers migrating, but if you look at the numbers here from East Africa and the percentages, you would see clearly that number one, there seems to be a very serious increase here in East Africa. It's about 36% increase. West Africa, Southern Africa used to be quite significant, but actually has dropped significantly recently. Not sure. I think there's more inter-Africa migration going on there. West Africa has picked up quite significantly. And then when you come to the point of numbers, reconciling the numbers, I try to reconcile the numbers to this 28 million to this 28 million here. I try to reconcile them using these data sets. And that's what I got here. But that's not the main thrust of what I'm trying to drive at. My main thrust of what I'm driving out here is more of the countries that actually migrate. Now, before I divert into that, let me quickly go into these data sets here from MPI, the Migration Policy Institute. Now, this is a whole very well presented chart of migrations from different regions. So before we say Africa migrates, let's even look at internal migrations first. Not very significant. Emigration, basically, not immigration. When we change it to migration outside, then you begin to see a better picture. So the data would have actually indicated the numbers emigrating, and you'd have seen bigger bubbles. The brown bubbles would have indicated a lot more immigration. It's not really showing, sorry. Very slow. Okay, I'm just going to move away from that. So when we look at the countries, so look at the countries where basically people are migrating to, the destinations, and which is why it's very important that I freeze this. Where they're migrating to, here's the population of the country, here's basically the the weight of the top 10 countries that people are immigrating to, interestingly, the numbers of top 10 countries is almost the same thing as the number of Africans migrating, 140 million. Then we look at the numbers of where they immigrate to, seems to be somewhere around here. We look at the general GDP. Why do they immigrate there? It's because of the income differentials in dollars. So we look at the GDP per country, and it looks quite high generally, except this country, Russia, who doesn't have really much. But generally speaking, if you go to the right of it, GDP per capita, we try to look at the living standards in terms of cost of living. So you have this income, for example, in the US, you have this cost of living, and you have very little money left. Only Germany, I think, has quite a significant amount of income left. Now, what I try to do is to use those ratios to understand why people are migrating there. And I looked at the exchange rates. Is it because of exchange rates that people are actually moving to those countries? Is it the African exchange rate that is depreciating that's possibly causing people to go overseas so they can have more money to remit? If you look at Europe generally, or these countries where they migrate to, the average or the typical inflation rate or the so-called exchange rate differentials in 10 years between 2012 and 2022 has also been about 20% plus. Now, the other countries would actually migrate most, and these are the countries that migrate most: India, Mexico, Russia, China. So Africa is just one of those countries that migrate a lot too. And the exchange rate differentials for those countries has been quite significant. Africa particularly, and we'll come to this data set here, Africa particularly has had a very bad exchange rate problem. And when you're not very productive, your exchange rate falls. If your exchange rate falls, what happens? You end up with a lot more poverty, and to a large extent, people want to go overseas because they feel that every hour of their living life is worth earning in dollars or pounds. So you depreciate your own currency. And when you look at this currency depreciations over the years, if I remove the excessive ones, these are quite excessive. A country like Somalia, for example, maybe during the war, let's just remove those excessive ones. The excessive countries are in thousands. I'll just remove them because they can give a better, they're most like outliers. And then the average rate for regions will then come to about 89% in Africa, 53 countries data. And on average, you'll see that Central Africa seems to have the least, and I think it's because of mostly the French Francophone countries. They think their CFA seems to have held on stronger than other African countries. But generally, you see the countries here in terms of North Africa and Southern Africa, their currencies have actually lost value more. And when you put that into context, then this other set of data would make sense, which is what we are looking at here, the next one. So we take the same countries again. I exclude these countries because I think they are unusual. Their data is very unusual because China seems to go overseas and they do go to work and maybe run business. It's not really as migrants per se. But generally, when I put the data in and I run it across by population, by country, I noticed that India particularly, has a similar demographics like Africa. That's about 1.3 billion population. Africa has about 1.3 billion. The average numbers in diaspora is about 17, about 1.something%. Africa has 140, which is about 10.7%. But the interesting part is when you look at the amount they remit, their national income, their remittances on average, they remit about 75. That's India. Remits about 77 billion. Africa remits about just 80. Similar also. In terms of income, on average per capita, the general per capita in India, I'm trying to use India as a real proxy for Africa. India is about 1.9, I think it's about 1,900 per capita, and Africa is about 2,000. Funny enough, on average, Africa is about similar to India. But if you look at the Indian, in terms of their income capacity overseas, I use the average rate of 5%. I did different rates anyway. I tried 5% to say, okay, look, if somebody actually sends so much money back, so this kind of money is what they send back, and they actually are paying from the after-tax money, it means that they are earning about this much. If you use 5% as the typical tax rate and the social services rate, it's not realistic. But then you say 1.5 trillion, and Africa is about 1.6 trillion, which is not really less comparable. But if you change that to about, say, 25%, then obviously the income they're earning will be less, because what we're trying to use, we are using the remittances as a proxy. I mean, there's a lot of data done here, but it's a proxy I'm trying to work on. But what I'm trying to drive at really is this. To summarize is to come here and say, when you put the data into graphs, at 25% cost of living, or so-called social cost, what it comes down to on average is that you see that India seems to have this green line for India represents, so I'm just trying to pull it up. The green line would represent income from overseas for India. India has a marginally far higher income overseas than living locally. And that blue line, if they were living locally, that's what they would have been earning. And if you follow the same thing for Mexico, and obviously the remittances are a fraction of that income, that marginal difference. This is remittance. You go to Mexico, Mexico seems to be marginally less. But when you come to Africa, Africa seems to reflect almost exactly the same proportion of what they earn overseas and what they earn locally. So there's a marginal difference between what they earn overseas in dollars and what they earn locally. Now, one of the big problems with that is the exchange rate. Massive exchange rate differences. And when the exchange rates are bad, I don't have enough time to do all that here, but generally when I try to work on the exchange rate, if you look at the bad exchange rate, for example, use the best exchange rate, which is North Africa, which is here, Central Africa, for example, you will notice the graph that the marginal difference between the income earned overseas and the income earned while local is very little. But when you change it to a worse currency or a worse rate, let's say with this percent, you will see that this graph is not marginally different, but you see a serious difference here, that the graph will come worse. What I'm trying to drive at really is when your currency is very weak. Unfortunately, sorry, I have too much data to do today, I don't have the time. Unfortunately, you end up with a disaster where your people would want to go overseas because they can do more in their lifetime per hour than staying local. So for me, coming to the question you asked about exodus is real. And the driving force is a lot more economic. While we have other social issues like dislocations, we have issues of displacement, we have issues of danger, security, we have issues of traveling for discovery, education, for example. We have desperation, we have disasters, we have disruptions, we've got displacement. All those D's are pushing people overseas, and unfortunately, the first people to go are going to be the skilled force. So yes, the data suggests that Africans are moving overseas. Exodus is real. Data validates that. Exodus for me is necessary because it leads to renewal. If it leads to renewal, at least you look at the story of Moses. At the end of Moses, went to Egypt, and the Israelites went to Egypt. They learned for so many years how to build the most successful economies. They built the economies, and they went back and built their own. The question is whether it's organized. When Exodus is not organized, then you have a crisis. Let me stop for now because.
All right.